Hey, everybody. Sunday evening. Cheers. It is unusually nice in Georgia for late San Diego. I don't know how everybody else is feeling. Got a weird feeling we're going early into autumn this year, and of course, I could be completely wrong about that. It could be 95 to 105 degrees in a couple of minutes. Who knows, considering we're hurtling headfirst into a climate disaster. But it's nice out here regardless. Got some decent bourbon. We got a lot to talk about tonight. We got a lot of questions, a lot of issues to go over. It's a weird moment, I think, post-Democratic National Convention, particularly moving into the Republican convention tomorrow. I think this is one of those things where you feel like, okay, the Democrats made their appeal. Is it going to work? Is it not? Some people felt hopeful after the convention. Other people felt like, here we go again. We're going down the same sort of road. We'll talk about that stuff. We'll get into it. I will say that, I wrote about this on Twitter today. I just had one of those like weird little moments. I didn't do like a picture thread or like a big, long, thought out thread. But I was thinking a lot about what the American right is and what they're doing and what it is we're dealing with like QAnon and Trumpism. And, it's something I've sort of understood, but I think it sort of clicked into place a little bit more today, particularly as we're watching not just like the right slide even further into the authoritarian abyss, but also like these just insane conspiracy theories. And it's just very clear. The American right has had control of this country for decades now. And by that, I don't mean that they've won every presidential election or that they've controlled houses of Congress, although they've done both. It's more about how the conversation takes place. I wrote about this in American Rule. It was something I sort of discovered that I didn't really understand, which is that Ronald Reagan in particular sort of won over the American conversation. You could no longer talk about American politics without first, dipping your cap to the idea that America was exceptional and was better than other countries. And to get elected in this country or to even be treated like a citizen of this country, you just sort of had to accept that. And you sort of had to pay tribute to it. And whenever you do that, whenever you immediately start off a conversation about American politics from a point of view that America is exceptional or it's the greatest country in the world, well, then immediately you open yourself up for a rejoinder, which is, well, shut up. Why are you asking to make it any better? Why are you complaining? You should be grateful, which is the conversation that the American right has dominated now for decades. What we're going through now, unfortunately, and we'll touch a little bit more on this with a couple of questions that we have. We're in a declining nation. We're in a declining empire. We're in a nation right now that has made so many mistakes for so long in so many different ways, and has used so much of our money and treasure and reputation and influence and political capital towards this American exceptionalism project, the idea that we should be in every other country. Everyone should either have a government like ours, or if they vote somebody in power that we don't like, we throw them out, organize a coup, something along those lines. We have spent so much time and so much money and so much energy and political capital on it. We can't do anything anymore. We just really can't. And, it's one of those things that I think we all watched, like Hurricane Katrina, barreling into New Orleans. Everyone's like, well, why aren't we doing anything? It's like, this government is not made to help us. This government has been bought and sold. The entirety of its energy and momentum has just been used towards the hegemony project. The idea of going around the world and trying to control future threats and trying to install, American values or whatever helps American corporations. Oh, thank you, Hagen. That's cool. But that's what it is. And now we're in a place where the rest of us are waking up from this. If we weren't already awake from it, we're starting to understand these things, that America is failing as a state. And meanwhile, you have Trumpism and the American right and all of these conspiracy theories. They're engaged in a violent rejection of reality. Because for them to start admitting that America is really in trouble, it would mean that their entire personality, their entire self, their entire viewpoint, their entire perspective would start to crumble. Because the American right is built on a very brittle tower of cards. It's all based on this myth of American exceptionalism. And once you question that even a little bit, that tower starts to sway. It starts to get ready to fall. And so they have to believe in conspiracy theories. How does a country that is ordained by God, an omnipresent, all-powerful God, how in the world could that country lose? How could that country suffer through a pandemic? How could that country watch hurricane victims get nothing? How could Puerto Rico be completely forgotten? All this stuff. And the truth is that all of our power and treasure and political capital have been used towards trying to take over the world through overt military action and covert military action. We don't have anything left for us. We're on our own in terms of this government. They don't have anything to give us besides violence. It's a failing state. And the sooner that we realize that, the sooner I think that we can come together and we can start rejecting that, and we can start building something from the ground up, something decent and human and real. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that we're in a really dangerous place in this country. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, one of these questions. We're in a really dangerous place in this country. But the encouraging thing is that in times of peril, there can also be great hope. I talk about this all the time. We're like right on the precipice of either something much, much worse, or we're on the precipice of something much better. We've already seen that American exceptionalism and hypercapitalism and white patriarchal supremacy, they don't work. They're destructive, and they lead us here to the point where the country is failing. We can choose something real and humane and fair. And if we do that, I think that we can win. And we'll talk more about that, because I'm not going to end any of these things on a sour note. And we have to talk about how to do that and where to get. But I keep telling everyone, and this is something that people keep saying, like, what do you think we should do? I keep saying it's 3 steps. One, we have to get educated. We have to understand what real history is, what's actually happened in this country, because the people who have controlled us and the people who have betrayed us, they've given us a false bill of sale. They've given us a false mythology of America that isn't real. American history really doesn't have much to do with what we've been taught, which is one of the reasons I wrote American Rule, which, by the way, it comes out in 3 weeks. I'm terrified, absolutely terrified. But we need to get educated. We need to understand where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. You need to get pissed off. You need to understand that your life could be better, the people you love could be better, your neighbors could be better, the whole entire country and society could be better, the world could be better. You do not have to accept scraps anymore. And the people who are trying to get you to accept scraps, they've screwed you and your family and the people you love over. So get angry about it. That way, number 3, you can get organized. We have to reject top-down power, because it's non-existent. It's a complete illusion that they've sold us on. We have to remember that through solidarity and organization and bottom-up grassroots organizing and recognizing in one another that we have good in us and that we can love one another and take care of each other and have a fairer, more humane society, then that means that we can build something better. And I have to say real fast before I get to the questions, one of the things I've been gaining hope from lately is stuff like this. The bourbon talk stuff. I mean, there's a couple of hundred people here hanging out with me drinking bourbon or whatever. I saw somebody eating Hershey Kisses, whatever. Here we are hanging out on a Sunday night, and we're talking about politics and danger, but we're together. And like some of us have got to know each other. We've been doing this thing for the Muckrake podcast where we've been watching the Democratic National Convention together, and like all kinds of people are coming together, forming little communities and getting to know each other and support each other and treating each other well, even though we don't know each other, right? I think that that's hopeful. And I think that when we start to put these puzzle pieces together and the information together, and we start remembering that we can organize and join together, that's an incredibly powerful thing. So do not despair. There's hope. But also at the same time, do not for a second forget that this is a moment of crisis. There's hope in it, but my God, we're in a lot of danger right now, and I think that we all understand that. And I think that that's also in these days with not only the way Trump is conducting himself and obviously endorsing things like QAnon and messing around with the Postal Service and obviously doling out cruelty left and right, and it's really frightening, and it's really, really bad shit, man. It's as bad as it gets, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately. So you can understand that these things are actual dangers, and they are real, and you're not crazy for recognizing this stuff. And I'm so glad that people are starting to wake up, because there are those of us who've been yelling and screaming about this for years. I didn't know that some people were going to come around. People are starting to come around. And that is hopeful to me, but we need to get hip to it in a hurry. Get educated, get pissed off, get organized. All right, let's start off with some questions. Alfonso says, how do you expect the RNC to be all about? Nothing but American exceptionalism. Absolutely. I think that you should turn on the RNC next week. And here's the reason why. I understand that it's gross, and I understand that you don't want to give people ratings or whatever. It is going to be a pure and uncut stream from another dimension. If you've ever watched the movie Videodrome, it's going to be a lot like that. This is going to be a round-the-clock horror show. And this is going to be the alternate reality that these other people live in. And I keep telling people that you have to know what these people are about. And we're going to talk about QAnon. We have to understand what these people are about. We have to understand what it is that they're breathing and digesting and what they believe, because that's the only way that we can combat this stuff. So I think it's going to be an absolute shit show. I completely agree. I think it's going to be horrible and weirdly terrifying. And it's going to be a bunch of people treating America like it isn't falling apart, and like 170 some thousand people haven't died, and like Donald Trump is a savior on earth. That's what it's going to be. But we need to recognize that. It's not enough to turn the other way and pretend like it's not happening. I think we need to see it. We need to recognize it. We need to deal with it. And we need to strategize against it, because it's going to be terrible. Mike Standish says, prediction on the most surreal moment at the RNC convention and or most terrifying policy idea introduced therein. I will answer the second thing because I know it. I can tell you right now, and unfortunately when it happens, I'm sorry that you're going to have to think about this bourbon talk and remember it. Basically, it's going to be a continuation of the Republican Party blaming China for the coronavirus. Obviously, they've been doing this with Trump's, racist and xenophobic attacks. But I've been trying to tell people left and right, like the Republican Party came together and all their strategists and think tanks came up with this strategy that you don't even defend Trump. You just go after China. And if it's necessary, we'll tiptoe up to a war with China. So one of the things you're going to see is not only the idea that Democrats, including Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, should be arrested, but you're going to hear a lot of people talk about possibly going to war with China. There's going to be like not only blaming of China, but you're going to hear a lot of people tiptoe up to the idea of actually taking out aggression on China. So that is going to be the policy idea. And of course, I mean, Trump, might talk about investigations or whatever. I assume that the Trump administration has had talks about what QAnon is and what these conspiracy theories are about. They'll push those. Absolutely, they're gonna push conspiracy theories throughout this entire thing. So I think that's gonna be the surreal moment. But there's also something weird that's gonna happen with this. In 2016, and by the way, I was at the Republican convention in 2016, and it was just absolutely rife with alt-right people, left and right, everywhere. Like you couldn't walk down the street without running into like Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos or whatever. And it was like this moment of transition where all of a sudden the old guard of the Republican Party was being overtaken by the Trumpist crowd, the ones that they had always used to raise money from and that they had always used to win elections with, but they were taking over. This one, there's no transition anymore. We are full-blown living in Donald Trump's headspace. That's what the RNC is going to be. It is going to be beamed out directly from Donald Trump's head, and we're going to have to reckon with that. I think I read today that he's going to speak every single night. And, I think he'll bring up a third term. I don't even doubt that for a second. They'll talk about third terms. He'll joke about being president until he dies. They'll probably joke about Trump Jr. or Ivanka being president. All that stuff is going to happen because that's what they do. They lay all their cards on the table. So that's the truly shocking stuff. It's going to be a broadcast coming directly out of this alternate dimension, and you need to be ready for it, and you need to take notes. Like, it's not enough to simply pretend that this stuff doesn't exist. And listen, it wears me out too. Like, having to pay attention to rising authoritarianism and rising fascism and white nationalism, white terrorism, white extremism, all of that, it wears me out too. But we have to look at this thing in the face because it's real. It's not just something that we can laugh about or dismiss, or the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. We have to fight for us. Jay Stewart says, I'm just curious, when I first heard that Trump might make his convention speech from the White House, many people said he couldn't because no partisan event can be held there. So do you know why or how it's happening? Now it's being treated as though it's common. I know it sounds very small. And I want to talk about Bill Kristol here in just a second, so I'm going to pause it over there. I know it seems small, the idea that Trump is going to give this speech from the Rose Garden or the White House or whatever, but this is an encapsulation of what Trumpism is. He shouldn't be doing it. The law says he shouldn't do it. There are norms and institutions in place that say that he can't do it. But you notice he's going to do it. The reason he's going to do it is because nobody's going to stop him. There's nobody in the government who's going to blow the whistle. There's nobody in the government who's going to step up and defend that norm or that institution. As a result, Donald Trump, like a velociraptor testing the fence at Jurassic Park, he finds a way through it. And I'm telling you that this is one of the reasons why you can't just rest behind laws and precedents and constitutions. People like Donald Trump naturally destroy them. And this thing where he's giving the speech from the White House, absolutely this shit should not happen. Absolutely Melania should not be talking from the Rose Garden. And by the way, look what she did at the Rose Garden. That's a different story altogether. They shouldn't be doing it, but they are, because there's no one there to stop them. And this is what authoritarians do. They find the weak places in the fence. They find the weak places in a liberal democracy and they destroy them. This is just a small little thing where he's given this speech from, but it is true. And real fast, I saw Julia say that William Kristol, Bill Kristol, said that the GOP was a death cult. Number one, welcome to the party. I'm so glad that people are starting to talk about this because some of us have been on this train for a very long time. The next thing I will say for Will Kristol or Bill Kristol or whatever we're calling him today, I'm so glad that he's saying that Trump is wrong. But I would love if one day I got on Twitter and I saw him reckoning with his part in creating a world where Trump existed. Kristol is one of the reasons we don't have universal health care. He went after it and he was playing quote unquote, hardball politics after Bill Clinton, and he kept common sense healthcare reform from happening. That's on him. That is one of the things that he did. And one day he will die, and that will be like in his obituary, and that will be on his karma or whatever you want to believe. So like all these Never Trumpers, the Project Lincoln people, throw arrows at Donald Trump all you want. Please do it. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like you didn't have a role in this stuff. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that all of you didn't get us in Iraq and that you didn't kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent people while spending trillions of dollars and getting us involved in wars. And I think it was something like 65 countries around the world. So listen, I'm all excited that everyone likes that Project Lincoln gets in Donald Trump's head, but those ads are the exact same ones that they used against liberals and Democrats. And I really don't like the dirty ads. I don't like the way that they deal with this. I don't like the dirty, evil, black magic that they're trying to carry out on everybody. I don't think that they should tell the Democrats what to do or how to behave. They should basically sit in timeout for a very long time and explain why they did the things they did. It would be invaluable. It would be invaluable if somebody like Kristol said, here's what I did and here's how I accomplished it. Here's how to reverse engineer it and then go from there. But no, they're grifters. They're trying to take over. And you're going to see a thing. And I keep talking about this and we'll talk about it later too. If Joe Biden gets elected, we are going to see a reckoning within the Democratic Party because people like Project Lincoln have tried to co-opt the Democratic Party. They've tried to tell the Democratic Party what to do, who to elect, who to vote for, all that stuff. And we're also going to see the left of the Democratic Party pushing back against Biden and Harris. It's just something we're going to see, and there will be a realignment. And that's if Biden wins. If they don't win, no idea. Literally no idea what ends up happening. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. Lewis all says, how will you endure covering the RNC coverage this week? I will watch your analysis, and that's all I can stomach. It'll be a week of disinformation. Absolutely, it will. I would like to invite you and anybody who's in the chat who spent last week with me and my co-host Nick Houseman for the Democratic National Convention. If you want to go over to patreon.com/muckrakepodcast, you can become a patron. We're doing live around-the-clock coverage of the RNC. We had a hell of a good time with the DNC, even though it was disturbing and there were some parts in it that were infuriating. This is going to be a different kind of a thing. And if you want to come hang out, we'll get through it together. That's what I was talking about earlier. Like, we'll figure out a way to manage our way through, and you'll get some information you won't get anywhere else. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to drink some bourbon the entire time. I went through a fifth of bullet during the Democratic National Convention. I went ahead and got a handle of larceny for this thing. I figured it was apt, larceny. So that's how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to have to indulge in some self-care. That's the thing that we all have to do. Is it's going to be hard, and it's a battle, and you have to take your wins and your losses when you get them. You're going to have to be able to watch this thing and understand it. And when you understand it, it's better than not understanding it and looking around being like, what in the hell is going on? I don't get it. If you have a decent idea of what's going on, it takes a little bit of the venom out of it, and it makes you feel like you can do something about it. So, yep, any level of patron works for the RNC talks. Yep. All right. Cops are a cult says, how do you combat something like QAnon that not only has the tacit approval of a political party, but has cognitive dissonance built into the messaging? Sometimes disinfo is necessary. Trust the plan. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about QAnon tonight because I want to talk about how we're going to do this thing. Trump not only endorsed QAnon, but has obviously been playing footsie with it for a very long time. So we need to talk about what it is. We need to talk about why it works so we can start taking some of the sting out of it. And this is going to be one of those things. There's a couple of questions in here tonight about radicalization and de-escalation. And this is going to be one of the themes of the evening. Okay? So, first things first. Here's the reason why QAnon is doing what it's doing. Besides the fact that it is infinitely interactive, you can create your own conspiracy theory, it makes you feel like you're doing something. The reason it works, first of all, is because people feel powerless. They have no idea what's going on because politics has been taken from them. And this is a funny thing. I didn't realize this until I was writing American Rule, and I'll bring this around. So Woodrow Wilson, who is a Democratic president and one of our worst presidents and one of the most disgusting people that has ever come to lead a country. Woodrow Wilson was the founder of what's called public administration, the idea of how you take care of large organizations and how you work things through. Woodrow Wilson was an elitist and a racist, white supremacist. His belief was that the machinery of power should be so complex that no one besides the most elite and the most powerful people would understand it. Everybody else would look upon it in awe. They would not even have the beginning of an understanding of how it worked. As the government grew under Wilson, that's sort of what it became. And all of a sudden it became very specialized, and it just, we had all these departments grow and all this stuff. It got to the point where the average American citizen had no actual idea about how government worked. It was something that happened in Washington, D.C. It didn't have anything to do with you or me. It was something that took place over there. And don't question it. Don't spook it, because it's working just fine. Don't worry, people smarter than you and more powerful than you are taking care of it. What happens with that is all of a sudden, if you are shut out of the process, you start making up stories. That's what always happens with conspiracy theories. If you don't understand how people with power are doing things, then all of a sudden, you got to come up with theories that make sense to you. So when they don't do things that help you, when all of a sudden you, as a working class person or a person of color, if all of a sudden you're being treated like garbage, you have to start understanding, why are they not treating me well? Why is the country not working? Why are we not in a really, really good situation? Because here's the thing. Woodrow Wilson was one of the purveyors of the propaganda that America was exceptional and perfect, right? So if America is exceptional, again, it's ordained by God, and it's the most perfect nation in the world, then how in the world could things not work, right? All of a sudden you start thinking, there have to be traitors. There have to be people on the inside of America, because an enemy would never beat us, right? We could not be overwhelmed. So it has to be an enemy, and it has to be someone on the inside. And you start seeing this really take hold in America after World War I with the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, and I know that we're all taught about the Red Scare post-World War II. It actually was post-World War I. There were tons of crackdowns on not just socialists, but also on labor unions, on African Americans, all these conspiracy theories that the Soviets were manipulating people on the inside. And guess what? It's anybody who questions America. Anybody who questions America must be a traitor, because America is perfect and God ordained and beautiful and perfect. So they are obviously traitors. They're not patriots. They're working with the enemy on the outside. So when you are in that mindset of American exceptionalism, it's a dichotomy. And that's another problem that we're dealing with, is one of the reasons that America is in this cesspool of conspiracy theories is because of the two-party system. What ends up happening is the people on both sides get in their trenches, right? And all of a sudden they're like, no, Democrats are perfect, Republicans are perfect, and you just sort of shoot at each other left and right. And what ends up happening is it just becomes, well, we are good, we want what's best, they have to be evil. Now, The left doesn't work exactly like that. The left has its own conspiracy theories, but those conspiracy theories are always about how power is applied and where power resides. The right is a morality tale, right? So one of the things that I have noticed is that you can short circuit this stuff when you reject what I would call conventional history or conventional understanding. So for instance, when I talk to people who are either QAnon adherents or Trump supporters, and I'm talking like cult-like Trump supporters, right? People who think that he's perfect, he's never done anything wrong. What I have noticed is if I will admit, because I'm sure you've had a conversation like this before, I'll say something critical about Trump and they're like, oh, I guess you think Hillary Clinton's perfect. And I'm like, actually, I don't think Hillary Clinton's perfect at all. I think that she voted for the Iraq War. That was a problem for me. I didn't like the way that she got on board with the Patriot Act. I don't think that she ran a particularly great campaign in 2016. And what ends up happening is it's like a little bit of a flag in that trench warfare set where all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're not diametrically opposed to me. All of a sudden, it's not just head-on collision. All of a sudden, we can have a conversation, and the person in the other side will start telling me, they'll be like, yeah, I don't actually think Trump is perfect either. And it's because they don't think that you are diametrically opposed and that you are a partisan. And if you come together and suddenly you're like, actually, I think the real problem with America is the fact that the distance between the people and power is too far and economic inequality. And also, by the way, I have a problem with NAFTA and the way the globalist market has exploited people and ruined my family. All of a sudden, you start having a conversation. And if you can have a conversation, you can disarm that stuff. But that being said, there are people who are Trumpist. There are people who are QAnon members. They're not going to have a conversation. They're too far gone because Trump and QAnon are who they are. It's who they are as people. They have went ahead and they have completely dedicated themselves to that idea. And at that point, they're members of a cult. And members of a cult won't necessarily leave because it's their own foundation that is in trouble. And if you start to trouble that Trumpism or you try and like trouble that stuff, it could actually lead to like a personal explosion. It could lead to like a personal breakdown. And this brings me to one of the big conversations that we have to have. And luckily, here we are hanging out on Sunday night drinking bourbon and being honest with each other. America has a mental health crisis. That is like one of the things that has fueled this, and nobody wants to talk about it. America has not treated mental illness like it is real. America has not put money into mental health, particularly post-Reagan, where he kicked everybody out of mental health hospitals, and suddenly, I don't know, you have a homeless crisis. Isn't that crazy? We have to be able to talk about this stuff because there are so many people in Trumpism and in QAnon who are continually reinforcing their mental health crisis through this stuff. Trumpism isn't just a political movement. It's not just a social movement. It's also a bunch of people who are in violent denial about reality. And it's one of those things. It's like you have to admit that you have a problem before you get help. So there's a lot of people that you can't necessarily reach, and there are others that you can. Lucky Otter says, Reagan was the start of the current GOP lunacy. I don't actually think Reagan understood what he was doing. Again, writing American Rule, and I didn't know this until I wrote the book. Reagan didn't really have a political philosophy. He was just a reactionary. He thought that young people were disgusting, and he was also like absolutely racist and white supremacist. He was just an actor who was sold on the idea of American supremacy and white supremacy, and a bunch of right-wing think tanks and reactionary groups gave him a script and he read it. That's who Ronald Reagan was. And I have to tell you, in the research I did for American Rule, he's a lot like Trump, man. Reagan was not intellectually curious. He had no idea what he was doing. He didn't actually want to do the job. He just wanted to be a spokesperson, which is what he did for GE and all these other companies. He just went out and spoke about how great America was. All right, next up. Monday says the FBI's assessment of QAnon that poses a domestic terrorist threat. How's it possible that proclaimed members are now running for congressional seats? The sad truth of this is that the Republican Party is being consumed by QAnon. And we've already seen this in modern times. We saw when the Tea Party started to take over the Republican Party, particularly in 2010. And what has happened for the last few decades is, we're going to talk about Putin here in a second. So what ends up happening is the Republican Party was feeding all these conspiracy theories to their followers, including white supremacists, white terrorists, white extremists. And they were, them and the NRA were making a ton of money off of all that stuff. And then eventually people started believing it. And, oh, Matt, I'm going to answer that in a second too. So what ends up happening is that the believers believe it, and then eventually they want politicians who believe it. And so in 2010, particularly with the Tea Party, which was completely manufactured by the Koch brothers and right-wing billionaires and libertarians, all of a sudden, Republican voters want Republicans who actually believe the conspiracy theories that they've been feeding their voters. So they took over the party in 2010, and then it was inevitable that we were going to end up with Donald Trump. So, yeah, that's unfortunately how we end up there. And now the QAnon thing, I'm sorry, but it's going to take over the Republican Party. That's just where we're going with this thing, and it's really a frightening thing. Baker says, how you doing, Baker? Young liberal, it feels like Democrats have decided to move to the middle right. Absolutely. It was a decision. Found this out writing American Rule. I didn't understand this earlier. In the wake of Reagan, Bill Clinton and a guy named Al Fromm, the head of the Democratic Leadership Council, decided that there was no way a Democrat would ever get elected fighting Reagan ever again. And as a result, they decided to intentionally move the Democratic Party right. So what ends up happening, and we'll talk about this in a little bit because I have another question like this. So what ends up happening is that they start presenting to the American public what they call Reaganism with human face, which is talking about American exceptionalism, talking about unchained capitalism, talking about power from trickle-down economics. And what you actually see, weirdly enough, in the 92 election is Bill Clinton at times would run on the right of George H.W. Bush, weirdly enough. And he actually made a claim through his candidacy that he was the rightful heir to Ronald Reagan, and that George H.W. Bush wasn't the rightful heir. So yeah, the Democratic Party moved to the right in the 1980s and at times have been on the right. They've been in consensus. It just so happens now that the Republican Party is so right and wallowing so far in fascism that the Democratic Party, which is center, center left, center right, depending upon what issue we're talking about, feels like they're like, raging socialists or leftist or something, but they're not. They're absolutely not. Matt says, do you believe that we as a nation need to hit rock bottom? I don't know. And that's a hell of a big question. We're going to talk a little bit about that with another question later, but there's a real possibility. I keep saying this. I think we're watching the decline of a nation. Snarky says, QAnon-related sex trafficking demonstrations. Jay Rosen's thread links to stories from the perspective of criticizing how the stories report these events uncritically. Oh, hi, Blakely. Oh, I do have a kitty. That's little Dixie. So here's one of the problems, is that our media has treated extremist ideas, particularly QAnon, Trumpism, all that stuff, they've treated it as if it's just normal and as if they deserve a place because Dixie is an absolute mess of a cat. And if she came out here, she would interrupt the broadcast without fail. It would be an absolute disaster. I'll talk about Dixie sometimes. She is a mess of a cat. Love her, but whew. But anyway, so like pretty soon we're going to have QAnon people on certain networks if we're not careful, because they're treating it more like it's an abnormality, like it's just some kind of weird kind of freak show, And the truth is that they have treated it for a very long time as if they have to cover it. It's something to talk about. It's an amusement. It also gets a lot of hits. It gets a lot of attention, a lot of eyes. And that's one of the bigger problems is I think that we have a media that, and I've talked about this on past streams, we have a media that is completely out of control in their profit margins and how they seek them, which is that they've admitted it. They don't care if a story that they tell or a perspective that they give hurts America, because that's what gets the most eyes and the most clicks. They are truly and honestly addicted to Donald Trump and Trumpism, and QAnon's no different. They're going to get a ton of money from this stuff. And I think that this is one of the biggest problems that we have, is that unfortunately we have an economy that actually benefits off of hurting Americans and hurting America. And it has for a while now. Erica says, Anonymous seemingly disrupts different systems. What are your thoughts about their absence in revealing or disrupting Q? I don't know what's going on there. I think the Q thing, and I actually believe that NBC probably found the people who started it. I believe right now that the person posting his Q is probably the person who owns 8kun. I've been talking with some of the other people who have been researching this along with me, and I think that that's who is currently posting his Q. But I think they've tracked down who they were. I don't know what Anonymous is doing, and I don't know if they're necessarily going to go after them, but there's like a weird morality with Anonymous, and maybe there's like some sort of a hacker code that I'm not privy to or something like that. Dan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about America becoming a full-on authoritarian state in the next 5 to 10 years? 10. 10. And that doesn't mean that we will, that is where I'm actually worried. And again, we're at that precipice. Something really, really good can happen. Something really, really bad can happen. And what's more, and I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit ago, like Joe Biden getting elected president doesn't mean that we're in the clear or anything, because we're not. We have movements in this country that are virulently opposed to admitting that we have a problem or that we need to readjust. We have a climate crisis brooding. And I have to tell you that if you think what we did to families at the borders was bad, just wait until we have millions of climate refugees. I mean, that if you think Tom Cotton or somebody like that isn't going to come around and like employ the same things or even worse, white supremacy, particularly in a decline, is going to be really, really ugly. So I'm at a 10. I'm at a 10 worried. But that doesn't mean that we're going to get there. Matt says, well, it's going to move us one way or another as we sit on the precipice. Well, that's the choice. You either let other people move us or we move it. You know what I'm saying? Like, either we sit back and we let fascist and authoritarian people and white terrorists move us, or we go ahead and we make the change. If this summer, which is one of the worst summers in my life, I don't know about the rest of yours, if this summer taught me anything or gave me any hope, it was like something with BLM. You notice that like people in the streets and making their voices heard and coming together in a solidarity movement, it changes everything, because all of a sudden the media is like, oh, we have to talk about this. Oh, shit. And all of a sudden you start to remember that politics isn't a spectator sport, and that actually sovereignty comes from the people. It doesn't come from the state, which, by the way, is the definition of fascism, the idea that all power and meaning comes from the state. It doesn't. It comes from the people. That's Rousseau's social contract. So if you want to push us one way or another in terms of the precipice, get in the streets, meet some people, put together an organization. Don't just depend on organizations that exist, because while you're giving money to them, some of that money is going towards stuff. Other stuff is just administrative cost. Figure it out grassroots. Start put together people who care about each other. I think the media should absolutely talk about QAnon. I think that they should talk about it, and that they should get completely honest about it. And I'm talking about like JFK Jr. faked his death. They believe in time travel. Like, make some people understand just how out there these people are, so they're not like sharing memes left and right. They're not suddenly because here's the thing. QAnon works like other cults. It starts off with a message that has some truth to it. The truth is that there are people who are powerful, who control things, and that you don't have power. That's a gateway to a cult right there. That's how all cults work, because that is truth, because the hierarchy in the caste system keeps you from having power. But the problem is, like, if you get into it more and more, that sort of machinery of the mind, all of a sudden you're like, well, I did this. I believe this. Well, I believe this. Oh, I'm not talking to anybody else. My family doesn't talk to me anymore. All I have now are QAnon supporters or Trump supporters or whatever. So I think the media should be talking about this. I'm absolutely worried about the time between the election and the inauguration. I think you should be too. Eric, my question: are you concerned that the gun-toting Proud Boys and similar thugs will try to intimidate voters at polling stations? I'm not just concerned. I think it is a statistical certainty. The question is whether or not we're going to have, like Trump threatened the other night, whether or not we're going to have federal troops out there doing the exact same thing. But absolutely, we'll have far-right paramilitary groups in the streets messing around with the election. I'd put money on that. I wouldn't even hesitate to put money on that. Jared, how are we going to deprogram people from Fox? I actually have that question coming on just a second. Promise I'll get to that. Bill says, here's a statement: consider Nixon was our last liberal president. I'll be enjoying a glass of Old Hammer. Cheers. The funniest thing about it is that Richard Nixon was actually like, he would be considered a Democrat now, besides the way that he accounted, with himself and tried to maintain power. I mean, he started the EPA. Like, he was trying to help with healthcare. He didn't do a great job with it. He started off the whole HMO thing or whatever. But yeah, like Richard Nixon would be unrecognizable in the Republican Party outside of his appeals to white supremacy now. The Republican Party has moved like crazy. I would actually make the argument that Eisenhower would be a liberal now. I mean, Eisenhower was the person who gave the speech that said that every warship, every bullet, every gun was a theft from the people. I mean, try giving that at this week's RNC. So I would actually make the argument that maybe it was Eisenhower, if you want to go on the right and find where liberals were or where leftists were, considering who they are now. Yeah, even Ford would probably be considered something of liberal now, outside of like the fiscal conservatism. Has any other, Lucky Otter says, has any other countries besides America sold the lie that is perfect and can do no wrong? Anyone who criticizes as traitor? Weirdly enough, Germany did it in the 1930s. Really weird. And what's more, America, and I didn't know about this until I wrote American Rule. Sorry about the plugs, but I honestly, I didn't know any of this stuff until I wrote that book. America and Germany were connected via the Romantic movement, which in the 19th century was this idea of like old ethnic tribes, particularly during the Dark Ages and Middle Ages. And this idea that like a people were strong because they were a people, and there was something inherently hierarchical about who people were. And actually the Romantic movement really, really thrived in America and Germany. And so that influenced not only the genocide of the Native Americans, but eventually the Third Reich. And America actually sent over a ton of like white supremacist thought and ideology, eugenic philosophy. Germany borrowed our laws. They brought over our eugenic experts. They brought over people like Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote, man, I can't remember. There's Madison Grant, who's The Passing of the Great Race, and Lothrop Stoddard, I believe, was The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy. I mean, they brought over Americans left and right, gave them medals, had them look at the eugenics program, advised them, met with Hitler and Himmler and all those people. So yeah, weirdly enough. So real fast, just to kind of run this through your head for a second, I want you to think about like the rise of the Third Reich, right? So they suffer like a crippling defeat in World War I. Germany was told that they were a superior people and that they had a superior military and that they could never be beaten in war. Sound familiar? Well, they got beaten. So all of a sudden, it's a country that is like reveling in their defeat. And they're like, how the hell did that happen? We're supposed to be stronger and better than everyone else. How could we possibly lost a war like a Vietnam? So all of a sudden you're like, well, how the hell could we have possibly lost this war? So then all of a sudden, Henry Ford, who is like peddling anti-Semitism around, which by the way, wasn't that something that the FBI published, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then Trump endorsed the anti-Semitic QAnon, and then Steve Bannon, the anti-globalist, got arrested. Isn't that weird that all three of those things just happen, bam, bam, bam? It's really weird. So Henry Ford starts floating around this idea of anti-Semitism and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and Hitler's like, that's a hell of an idea. Absolutely, we were betrayed by the Jewish people. That's the only way that we could have possibly ever lost World War I. So we are going to reestablish Aryan supremacy, and we are going to get rid of this internal enemy. And here's the thing. That is what happens with all fascist conspiracy theories. They always take place in a country that feels like it has lost something, and they have to find a reason to believe that they have lost something, and they don't want to look in the mirror, and they don't want to think about the mistakes that they've had, so they blame a vulnerable population and a conspiracy theory, and suddenly it's like, well, these people have been out to get us, and they've killed us, and they've ruined us. We have to do something about them. We have to preemptively attack them, right? That's how you get Holocaust. That's how you get genocides, and that's exactly what's brewing here. All right. Do I believe Biden and Harris will actually hear and enact progressive policy if they win? I don't know. There's a part of me that I really don't know what a Biden administration is going to do. There's a possibility he'll go in there and just try and like sweep up some of the mess. I'll get into JFK Jr. in a second. There's an interesting little thing going on there. I think there's a possibility it might just be sweeping up and trying to put America right again, or at least as close to right as it will get. There's a possibility that they're going to recognize that on their left flank there is growing power and influence, particularly with younger people. So they might actually let some of those people come to the table, or there might be, as the Democratic Party has done from time to time, there will be a civil war between the old guard and the new guard, and we'll see what happens at the end of the day. So there's a possibility that we'll see some progressive legislation. There's some that we might not. Real fast, So what is their obsession with JFK Jr. as an ally? It's a couple things. We're talking about QAnon, by the way. One is that it links JFK to Donald Trump, right? Because they're still trying to explain what happened with John Fitzgerald Kennedy, why he was killed, and all of a sudden the conspiracy theory that he was killed by deep staters all of a sudden makes it not a partisan issue. He was a Democrat that was killed by the deep state, and then the Democrats were part of it and it went forward or whatever. The other part is it links in Hillary Clinton because there was a possibility that JFK Jr. might have ran for the Senate at some point and that she needed to get rid of him. So it's just connections. It's all of a sudden you say this thing happened, and all of a sudden it comes together for them. But it's a very weird thing. Zach says, just watch The Searchers with John Wayne. Good movie. So many American myth tropes in it. Us boomers have been brainwashed for years. Thoughts? Absolutely, you have. And here it is. And by the way, I mean we're 45 minutes in here, so let's get a little deep in this thing. One of the problems with America is that Americans are in denial that they are influenced by things like propaganda and sales appeals and rhetorical appeals. We have been floating in mass media propaganda for as long as there has been mass media. One of the things that I found, which was crazy, again, writing American Rule, is particularly post-World War II, there were all of these agreements within Hollywood and in television studios and radio stations and everywhere you could find mass media that we didn't want to promote any anti-American ideas. We didn't want to promote any anti-Christian ideas. We didn't want to promote any subversive ideas. So all of our programs are going to be very wholesome. They're always going to pay attention and pay respect to God and cops and authority and the flag and all of this stuff. And so what ends up happening is you get sold propaganda from the very beginning of mass media. Like it was a total inside job. Like, and you actually find, weirdly enough, that the people who really created it, you ready for this? In Hollywood, the person who writes a lot of these materials that brings together the ideology of right-wing propaganda through mass media, Ayn Rand, weirdly enough, who was a screenwriter for a hot minute. She starts putting together this stuff for Hollywood to suddenly become an ally of American ideals. And all of a sudden, a lot of these left-wing people start getting kicked out, of course, because we have the Red Scare. We start having McCarthyism. These people get blackballed. They get kicked out of Hollywood. And suddenly you have people like, Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, weird little thing, I didn't know until I wrote American Rule, FBI informant. He was turning in people from Hollywood left and right. So all of a sudden you have people like Ronald Reagan, John Wayne, all of these big, giant Hollywood celebrities who are all like, Walt Disney. And all of a sudden, I'll answer that in a second. Thank you, Rebecca. Edward Bernays played a huge role in all of this. That's another part of American Rule too. So all of a sudden you just have like mass media that's giving you all these pro-American ideals, and it creates what we've now come to term the consensus, which conventional history treats like it was like this moment where we were all kumbaya and we all got along and we all did well. Well, we didn't. You know who didn't do great? Women, people of color, LGBTQ Americans. A lot of people were oppressed and a lot of people were treated like shit. So you have like all of these ideas of what America is. They cleaned up the Old West. That was purposeful. They basically took a genocide of the Native American people and they turned it into an adventure story. It was a bunch of cowboys running around shooting off their guns, but they were Americans, damn it. And all of that is just propaganda. And it was used to subvert us and used to like paper over any type of subversion, any type of protest, and anything that would talk about what America actually was and what it could be. But we also have another problem, which is we live in these mass media fantasies. We're like, well, it's just a movie. Well, it isn't. It isn't. It's a reflection of society. And what ends up is there's a loop. There's a feedback loop between the mass media we consume and the mass media that we create. So like we'll watch something that makes us feel like the world works one way. And so we'll make something and then it'll go back and forth. It's like the loop that Trump is stuck in with Fox News. He believes it's real. Fox News talks to him and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So yeah, absolutely. We've been brainwashed. That's absolutely the truth and how mass media works. And it's almost impossible to imagine a system where it didn't work like that. But that's where we are. Rebecca says, what book did I think I was writing when I set out to write American Rule? Here's what I thought. I knew politics and history really, really well, or I thought I did. But I couldn't explain Donald Trump. I could understand what had happened with the Republican Party. I could understand what happened with Fox News and right-wing propaganda and all that stuff. I basically went all the way back into like the 1960s, and then everything got a little fuzzy because then I was like, well, we're heroes of the world, yada, yada, yada. I thought I was going to go back and I was going to look at American history and, like, really learn a couple of things and really understand how the myth of American exceptionalism changed how we viewed history. What ended up happening was I learned that the myth of American exceptionalism and American history as we know it is probably the greatest weapon that has ever been constructed in human history. And it's a lie from the very beginning. I have to tell you, I started out the first chapter writing about the founding of the country. And I didn't know about the founding. And classes didn't teach me, and school didn't teach me, and textbooks didn't teach me. It was completely different from what I expected. And, I actually found out that a lot of historians and scholars considering the drafting of the Constitution a coup, which I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea that that's how it worked. And sort of the divide between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And it was a completely different ride than I thought. I have to tell you, I hope you read it. I hope you read American Rule. I'm very, very proud of it, but it is a completely different American history than I even thought existed. And then I started reaching out to like historians and scholars. They're like, "Oh yeah, for sure, that's the story. Just no one's really connected it that way." And I was like, "Well, shit, that's great. Here we are." Ungus Fungus says, "Is it possible and to what extent our democracy is already destroyed via foreign influence and we just don't know it yet? In other words, what are the odds we are too far gone regardless of what we do and how much we protest?" This is a lot. And here's the truth. We have had our democracy not just through foreign influence but inside influence. I mean, we've watched the Republican Party and the American right chip away at American democracy for years because they are a group of people who are trying desperately to hold on to power. They don't want people to vote, and so they've disenfranchised them, they've gerrymandered, and they've used disinformation. So it's been happening for a very long time. And we're going to talk in a minute about the ideological connection between modern Russia, modern Putinist Russia and America, and why the American right and why they are so simpatico in terms of ideology. And the big part of it that we need to understand is that right now, America is in trouble. It doesn't mean that we'll always be at this place. I actually think that if we recognize it and we understand, again, get educated, get pissed off, get organized, I think if we recognize what has happened, we can push it back. And that's the secret here. And that's the reason there's hope, is it's not too late to do this. We are reaching a point of no return. I'm telling you, authoritarians are really hard to get out of power once they get into power. Real fast, Sarah says, "Why do women support Trump? Don't get the Southern women Trump supporter, drives me nuts." So here's the thing. White supremacy isn't just a male condition. There are a lot of women who hold on to the privilege that they have because they are white, or maybe they are white identity Christian. Also in the South, it's about this idea of power, maintaining power, or re-recognizing power. Also, there's a lot of internalized misogyny that people have. It's a weird giant thing. Again, it goes back to what I was saying. We really don't understand ourselves. It's a mental health problem. Is we have so many Americans who don't understand why they believe the things they do, why they do the things they do. They believe that the way they behave in public, or the things that they do, or the way that they project themselves, they believe that these things just happen. And they don't just happen. There's so much stuff that actually occurs that leads into who you are and how you behave out in the world. And it's that divide between who we think we are and who we actually are, that again, like it's a mental health crisis, and it's one of the problems. Heath says, "Earlier this year, I would have agreed, but I'm less and less convinced that a Biden win would actually be better for the country if it only serves to roll back the clock a few years. How's open revolt against the U.S. government not preferable at this point? Hell." Okay, so here's the thing. Here's where I stand on all of this. Joe Biden was not my candidate that I wanted to vote for, and here is a frightening thing that we have to keep in mind. There are probably many realities out there where Joe Biden wins the presidency and people sigh a big sigh of relief, and they're like, everything's fine again. Trumpism's gone. We're not going to have that problem anymore. And they sort of go back into sort of a slumber, the slumber that they were in before Donald Trump got elected. That's a dangerous world, because Trumpism isn't going to go away with Trump. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Trump isn't the disease, he is the symptom. There's something that's worse here, and there's something that has been brewing for a very, very long time. And just because Trump gets out of office does not mean that suddenly everything is put right again. It actually means that there is time where there is a possibility that other people could organize and then gain power. And there's a possibility that people right now, well, not a possibility, this is happening. People are reverse engineering what Trump has done, trying to figure out how to use an ideology. Because Trump doesn't really have an ideology. He's a white supremacist internally, and he's an authoritarian because he's incessantly narcissistic and insecure. But, you know, he has no discipline whatsoever. He doesn't have a working ideology. He doesn't have an end project. It's just about destruction and personal profit. And so there is a possibility that maybe he would get elected and people would take their foot off the gas. But I will say this. I will hurt my hand voting for Joe Biden, and it's because we cannot have a person in office who's trying to dismantle government and who doesn't care about 170,000 plus people dying and suffering and possibly could start a war over here, or is over here trying to get rid of the EPA and poison the water and poison the air. My preference, my huge preference, is that we elect Joe Biden president of the United States of America, and then we start having like, you want to staunch the bleeding, and then we start having a massive, very, very important, integral conversation about what America is and what America could be. So I would say vote him in, and then afterwards do not let up. It does not stop in November. It doesn't stop in January. You have to understand that America is in real lasting trouble, like real existential crisis. Like, winning this election or escaping a stolen election is absolutely integral, but that doesn't mean that the work stops, because it can't stop. This country has been just run into the ditch, and we are in some really, really bad shit right now. So my argument is, get the dangerous, malignant narcissist out of office so we can't do any more damage, and then we can get to the real work of trying to figure out how to make things better. All right, Catherine says, if you were head of a mainstream media organization, what would you do differently to fight the disinformation and toxic manipulation? So here's what I would say. I would go in and I would say the party's over. We are done profiting off of dysfunction, misinformation, and stuff that hurts people. We just can't do it anymore. And I understand that maybe that means we're not going to be number one in the ratings, and we're not going to have the most subscriptions, and we're not going to have the most clicks and all that bullshit. But I have to believe, and if you want to... If you want to live in a country that doesn't work this way, feel more than free, because you're living there now. And if you want to continue it, do it. I have to believe that if you act ethically and you act good, that eventually, if a capitalist system has anything that works about it, like, we would reach a point where people would prefer that. And maybe that they treat it seriously. It would lead other people around. Fox News led MSNBC and CNN. It led them right. They saw that they were profiting and they were getting ratings and all this stuff. And so in the 1990s and then into the second Gulf War, they led MSNBC and CNN to the right with them. I have to believe that there's a counterbalance, and you have to treat this stuff seriously. And you have to treat this stuff with ethics and morality and basic human decency. So if I was in charge of a mainstream media organization, I'd be like, we're going to stop being addicted to things like Donald Trump. We're going to stop being addicted to spectacle. And we're going to do a really big job of looking into stories that aren't considered sexy. We're going to go into small towns. We're going to go into schools. We're going to show you what life on the ground is actually like. We're going to talk a lot about healthcare. We're going to talk a lot about education and infrastructure. And we're going to make it something that people want to absorb and want to learn about. That's how I would change it if I was in control. Because I think that is the hard work that needs to be done. I 100% do. And I think that I think for the longest time, these networks have been like, well, what do you want us to do? We're actually an entertainment show. We're not actually about news. And there's good journalists out there. There are people who, I know the billionaires don't want that, but maybe the rest of us can make up for the difference the billionaires don't want. That's the other thing. I have to tell you, based on what I've learned from the Muckrake podcast and what we've been doing with the Patreon, I didn't want to do table reads for companies that I didn't believe in. I didn't want to get, on the air and like talk about things that possibly caused cancer or things that I thought reflected poorly on me and my ethics. And so I opened it up for grassroots funding. And when I did that, what I ended up finding out is that you not only you make enough to live, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not making enough to live in the worst city in the world. But you build community. And if you do something right, and I think if you do it passionately and you do it for the right reasons, I have to believe that eventually you will attract other people who want to do it for the right reasons. So I hear you. The billionaires aren't going to be on board. The corporations aren't going to be on board. You got to try something else. I really, really, really think you have to try. By the way, 10 seconds until we've gone an hour. We got a few more questions on here. We got a slate of questions, so hang out with me, eh? 2, 1, cheers. It's good stuff. Okay. Sir Fox, how in the hell can we prepare journalism for dealing with QAnon promoting members of Congress? Hey, here's a thought. Let's get people in the air who actually understand them. Let's actually, I don't know, people like Travis View or Will Summers, or I'll do it. I'm happy to do it. I'll Zoom from in there. I'm happy to go on TV whenever. But they don't want to have big conversations that are going to upset people. So they'll do like a little quick vignette that makes it seem like maybe it's normal because they don't want to alienate any viewers. But you need to actually get people on who understand this stuff and actually want to talk about what's actually happening, as opposed to just giving you like little 10-second sound bites, which is one of the reasons why a lot of these people, a lot of these companies don't have people like myself, Kinzier, or Snyder, or any of those other people on. Tonight I'm drinking Woodford Reserve. That's what I'm doing tonight. I've got Larceny for the Republican National Convention starting tomorrow. All right. Oh, no, Julia, I just saw Get Rid of Your Question. That's the next one, actually. Can you speak to the near brainwashing that has taken place in order for it to be one true believer in QAnon and Trump, and how it has to do with Christianity and evangelicalism? It absolutely is the exact same thing. They're living in a mythical reality where there's a supernatural battle between good and evil. And as a result, they believe that they are part of the good side, and that gives them something to work on. It keeps them from having to engage with who they are and what they believe and what they've gone through. So as a result, it's the same sort of magical thinking and the magical idea of you're fighting off a conspiracy and you're a soldier, for God or good or whatever you think it is. And so it gives them identity. And it's the same mindset, unfortunately. And that doesn't mean religion has to be like that. I mean, I didn't know this because I grew up in what I now consider the cult of the shining city. Absolutely, there's money behind Q. There's millions behind Q. I grew up in the cult of the shining city, neo-Confederate, white identity, evangelicalism. And the idea that there was another type of religion out there never, ever crossed my mind. I never thought that was true. I thought there was my church, and then there was, evil, and that was it. But the truth is, there's like religion out there that doesn't treat this like this. It allows people to think for themselves. It allows people not to believe in these, fascistic conspiracy theories. But it also just so happens that neo-Confederate evangelical white identity church, it's part of this big giant power structure. It's part of this whole idea that white people, particularly white identity evangelicals, should be the ones who rule the world. And so as a result, they have to take over the world, which is what people like Bill Barr believe. Could it die out when the election is over? I think money is going to be over. And again, if I went into Congress or I went into anywhere, I would just spend so much time working on reform of money in politics. That would be like the one thing that I went after. And Rhonda said the same thing, QAnon, the religious right. That's the other thing. And you have to understand something. A large part of the reason QAnon is gaining adherents and followers, it's the evangelical right. Because they have been so manipulated, they have been treated with so much cult propaganda and programming that they have to look through a lens where Donald Trump is a savior, and QAnon gives it to them. So they are primed and ready, and you are seeing a ton of evangelical white people starting to go over to QAnon. So it's really, really tied up. Salmon, I'd like to know your thoughts about Portland, given the Saturday drama. Overall, what you think is happening there on the ground, how it's being used nationally as a political prop, and just the overall cognitive dissonance. So what's happening in Portland, of course, is that Portland got turned into the cause célèbre of the right. And so the Proud Boys showed up there and, started swinging and spraying bear mace and all that stuff. I was going to post some of this stuff. I want to say it was yesterday, maybe. Yeah, I guess it was Saturday. I was going to post a video from it, but also I didn't want to necessarily, like, I don't know. It was disturbing stuff, the violence that was taking place. But I almost posted it, and I was going to say something like, people need to understand that, like, we're having small Civil War like skirmishes in the streets. And again, I was working on American Rule, and I didn't understand the Civil War or how it came about. It was bullshit like this. It's when Americans start seeing themselves as completely different people, and they start believing these conspiracy theories. And it's already been violent. People have already been killed in the name of QAnon. There's already been assassination attempts in the name of QAnon. And this kind of stuff. And they were out there with the Proud Boys. They honestly believe that they are fighting an invisible war that only they understand and that the liberals are part of or whatever. So it's building. And we're only a couple of months out. And it's going to get worse. And I was telling people in 2016, I was going to all these Trump rallies. I was covering the campaign. I was telling people we will be very lucky if a lot of people don't die out of this. And we still will be, because there's a potential for great, great violence. Lewis Hall says this sounds like a dry run for violence during the election. I completely agree about that. I really do. I think election night might be pretty bad. I'll be real with you, and the time after it. Honest Rocker says, hey, Honest Rocker, cheers. Do you think DeJoy is nervous about confronting Katie Porter tomorrow, or has he mastered the art of feeling nothing? He feels nothing. Here's something that we also have to understand. And this is something that the networks have done and the social media has commodified. We need to understand that these hearings don't really do anything. These hearings are spectacles. There's something that we tune in for. It's something that gets high ratings. It gets a lot of traffic on social media. And it gives an opportunity for politicians to make fundraising videos. So Katie Porter will probably grill him, and, nobody's going to care. And it's just going to be one of those things where we'll have champions, we'll have heroes. It's the exact same thing when we were taking Robert Mueller and putting, photoshopping his face on like Captain America's body or whatever. These things, they are ESPN highlights. Yeah, these hearings just aren't anything. And the reason that they're not anything is in the past they used to deal with actual public shame and repercussions. The Trump administration doesn't give a shit about any of this, and there's nobody in Congress who's actually going to do anything about them. It would take the Republican Party actually living up to their oaths, and they're not interested into it, unfortunately. They can hold people in contempt of Congress, but it's just probably not going to do it. This guy in my neighborhood, his car, he just pops it all the time. It's so terrible. Joan, I just want to know how Mnuchin ended up being the one behind the USPS cluster. I don't know. I don't know how in the hell he got in charge of it, but they just do whatever they want. That's who the Trump administration is. They'll just put whoever they want, wherever they want, and then they'll figure out how to screw it up and how to steal money from it and how to dismantle it. It is, it's mind-boggling. Dialectical says, I'd be interested to hear more specifics on how to de-radicalize and bring down the temperature in the country. So here's what I have to say. A big part of it is Trump. A big part of it is that he is somebody, he doesn't even necessarily believe in a lot of the stuff that, that he says necessarily, but he also doesn't have that restrictor on him where he's like, oh, I don't know if I should say this. That might lead to bad things. That might lead to somebody saying, I don't know, sending bombs to Democratic leaders and members of CNN or whatever. He doesn't have that. So there's a possibility that if he gets defeated and he slunks off into the good night and he just looks like he got off a bender and maybe, I don't know, maybe he gets a show on Fox News or OANN or maybe whatever, which I actually, here's a prediction. If he just loses and he accepts it and he doesn't get prosecuted or whatever, there's a real possibility he'll just host a show from like a facsimile of the Oval Office and he'll just spout bullshit for hours at a time, which I would not be shocked if that happened. But there's a world there where that tamps down the temperature a little bit. But the problem is that the Republican Party understands now that they can raise a ton of money and win a lot of elections by turning it up like Trump did and behaving like he did. So we have a game theory situation. And it's much like a Cold War. It's like we have thermonuclear weapons, you have thermonuclear weapons. How do we approach that? And the idea is, well, you have to assume that the other person will destroy you and they will assume that you destroy them. And so you're always coming up to the point of nearly destroying each other and hopefully not. That's game theory, which, again, it's not something I understood until I wrote American Rule. The hope is that we can reach a point where the Republican Party either goes away, which would be wonderful if they're not allowed basically to participate in democratic goings-ons anymore because they lose every election they're a part of, and hopefully maybe something else will come along and replace them, which would be great. That would be fantastic. Or maybe they'll finally make good on this idea that they can find some sort of different gear, but I don't necessarily believe that they will. I think that we're looking at a situation where it is going to escalate and escalate and escalate, and we might. I think QAnon's going to take over the Republican Party for the most part. It's terminally ill with QAnon and conspiracy theories and white supremacy. I think the thing that we haven't talked about, though, is we haven't talked about the fact that there are unpredictable things. We always assume that tomorrow will look like today, but then there are major events. There's like a September 11th, there's Pearl Harbor, there's all kinds of things that happen that change the course of history. We don't know what that is yet. But there's a very real possibility that we are just tiptoeing around something major that could possibly change the country. Okay. They're taking your kids next. How do we engage with Fox brainwashed people? Just talk about the facts that Fox is a bunch of billionaires who are appealing to poor white people and making them fear, people of color, and talk about the fact that it's just, the New World Order. That's all it is. Once you understand what they're doing, you can break it down so quick. And immediately what they'll say is they'll be like, what about MSNBC or CNN? You think they're real? And it's like, no, they're corporate-owned news networks. Occasionally they'll get something right, and other times they're just towing a corporate line. And suddenly you're having a conversation where it's you and them versus everyone else. And all of a sudden you've created your own little ecosystem. I keep saying, I think the secret is that trench warfare mentality. Once we get out of it, you can start finding common ground and bring people back. But that doesn't always work because some of them are so ingrained with Trump, QAnon, Fox News, whatever. There's no walking that stuff back. Baker says, do I think there are enough young conservatives to keep Trumpism alive? I actually think the next generation is decidedly more left-wing. So there is a possibility that eventually they'll move that route. But I have to imagine the Republican Party, it's going to take a little while for them to recognize that that has happened. They'll continue trying to fix elections. They'll continue working with countries like Russia. They'll disenfranchise people. Maybe eventually they'll get the memo. I don't know. Aaron, have I been able to maintain relationships with friends or family members who are still Trump supporters? I don't have friends who are Trump supporters. I do have a lot of family members who are Trump supporters. I love them very much. And I'm very frustrated and heartbroken all the time. I will share this. I don't talk about this all the time. I've watched my family swallowed by conspiracy theories and paranoia. I've watched them radicalized into white supremacy and just like the worst kind of behaviors. I can tell you this, it gets worse when their lives get worse, when they're suffering financially or they're going through a divorce or they're having some sort of personal crisis. That's when they jump further into the thing. I try and be there for them, but it's really hard sometimes, particularly when I see when I see them pushing like white supremacist ideals. I step in, I say something. Sometimes they listen to me, sometimes they don't. What helps in the conversation is they know that I'm an honest broker. They know where I came from, so they don't think that I'm like a deep state operative or something like that. But it helps. No, I don't get into physical fights with them. There have been heated arguments in the past. And, I've spent a lot of time thinking about where all that started. And it started when I was younger. There was a lot of socialization. I wrote about this in my masculinity book, The Man They Wanted Me to Be. There was a lot of socialization and pressure to be a certain way and to be a callous man and not really think about things, not really question things, not express myself, not communicate, all that. But then later on, that stuff started morphing into like xenophobia and anger and hatred and racism, particularly post 9/11. And I started realizing that something was going on, that something was changing. And I think masculinity and white insecurity and just internal insecurity and mental health, I think all that is wrapped up in what we're talking about. Both, Trumpism, QAnon, Republican Party, the American right, racism, all of it is wrapped up in that insecurity, unfortunately. Joe, thank you for reading the book. It means a lot. Wobblies Unite. Would you say that the problem with our nation is a lack of unity within the masses? What mechanism is causing that tribal fracturing? Here's one thing that you need to know about American history is that from the very beginning, with the actual writing of the American Constitution, the decision was to fracture the American people. The idea was that the elite should control everything, and that in order to keep everybody down here believing in liberty and freedom and equality, they could get the illusion of power, but they should never be allowed to trust one another lest they become the majority. Which, weirdly enough, I'm sure you heard, they've talked about like the tyranny of the majority and, making sure that we don't do that type of stuff. And what actually has occurred is that we have been divided. And that's one of the reasons why racism is such a powerful weapon. It's one of the reasons why they chalk us up into like all these little divisions and all this stuff. They want to put us against each other. What ends up happening is these conspiracy theories always pit us against each other so we don't find common ground. And so racism, nativism, nationalism, all these things, they break us apart from one another, so we never realize that through solidarity and organization, power comes from the grassroots as opposed from top down. As long as they divide us, they win. And here's the thing. The modern Republican Party and the Trumpism movement realizes that that's the only way that they could possibly ever win an election. They don't have anything nearing 50% of the country. In fact, Trumpism is probably closer to 25%. The Republican Party is probably 40% in totality, maybe 44%. The only way they can win elections is by dividing us and playing upon our fears and our worst instincts. So that's the reason why we're constantly at each other. Not to mention that hypercapitalism, you have an entire system in which profit is made off of profiting off of our fears and insecurities and trying to say, oh, you're this type of person, you're this type of person, you're that type of person. It ends up being like Coke versus Pepsi or whatever. And it ends up becoming, oh, I'm a Levi's person or I'm that type of jeans person. Like it ends up, chopping us up. And it's always about dividing us. Matt. Media declares Biden the winner of the 2020 presidential election. Trump refuses to accept the result and makes unsubstantiated claims of widespread voter fraud. What happens next? In a world that made any sense, the media would just immediately scorn him and we would be in the streets and it would be over within the next day. The frightening thing is that is probably not how it's going to be. I keep telling everyone, and somebody reached out to me and I'm going to bring this out. I keep saying that I think that we should... Oh, I'll answer that about the communist thing here in just a second, Michelle, because I think that's an important thing. And that's about being educated, and that's about being pissed off. I think that we should vote and then be ready for mass demonstration. I keep saying vote early and be prepared rest of the time. I really don't know what's going to happen. I really, truly don't. I want to believe that it'll be a landslide and Trump will have to accept it and Republicans will have a Nixon moment where they're like, it's over, you have to stop. I don't believe that's who the Republican Party is. I don't believe that's who Trump is. So I think it's going to last much longer than the night of the election, but we need to be ready the night of the election in case any funny business happens. Real fast, Michelle says, how do we convince them we're not communist? So this is about being educated. This has happened throughout the 20th century. Ever since there was a Soviet Union to scapegoat. And again, this goes back to like post-World War I and then, of course, post-World War II. The American right has always maintained power by saying that anybody who criticizes America and the American way of being, they're obviously Marxist, right? They're obviously part of that conspiracy to bring the country down. If you understand and if you can point out that these are the times it's happened, and again, that was with, and by the way, you could even start talking about the Confederacy and how there was a conspiracy of abolitionists or whatever. You can just point out that like these conspiracy theories have happened time and time again throughout American history. And all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, that sounds right, because it's right. Because here's the thing, when you have truth on your side, it has the advantage of sounding right because we feel it. It's like a tuning fork of the soul. And all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, it did happen there, 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 and there, and there, and there. And then all of a sudden it's like, by the way, let's have a conversation about what socialism is and what Marxists are and what they aren't. And once you start having that conversation, you're actually talking about substance as opposed to instead of just talking about, fear mongering. Alexis, going right with it. When you say we must prepare to take to the streets, would you provide details on how you see that going? I'll tell you what I would like to see. I would love to see some leaders emerge, but also I would not mind if it was just a grassroots, spontaneous sort of thing. There's a possibility, again, that that the people are just going to have to go out there and put things right. But there might be a possibility that we might go in the streets and we can't get out of the streets, which is one of those things that you have to recognize is when you are out there and when you are actually organized and in solidarity, you force the media to tell the narrative that is true, which is that this person with Trump, this isn't okay. This isn't all right. I would say stay where you are. I would say do it in your community, because there are going to be people in your community, even if you live in like a red state or a red town or whatever you want to call it. There are going to be people who care, and there are going to be people on the right who are Republicans, right-wing, Trump supporters, all that stuff, who know deep down that it's not right. There are going to be the cultists who would be ready to kill somebody and incarcerate somebody and lobotomize reporters or carry out the day of the rope or whatever. But there need to be people who see that it's not okay. And we need to hope that somehow or another conscience sparks in all of this. Niburgerian says, thank you for your excellent work. Thank you. I appreciate that. A question, any thoughts on what would unfold if Donald Trump makes a mess of the election and financial markets respond by crashing? Okay, here we go. You ready? Here's some hard truth. If Donald Trump took over the country in an authoritarian sweep and rejected an election and, basically stole everything, I don't think the market would react by going bankrupt. The problem is that the market really doesn't have anything to do with the health of the country. They like Donald Trump. They like Donald Trump a lot, because he is all about hyper-capitalism and letting them go and letting them do whatever they want and rolling back regulations. So if he stole things, it wouldn't bust, because they're not interested in the health of the country. It might be if there were like massive demonstrations and there was massive unrest and death in the street, which there probably would be, but I think they would still go. The process of earning money has nothing to do with America or a nation state or anything approaching patriotism or the good of a country. That was divorced a long time ago from the fate of countries. They don't consider countries. They don't think about nations anymore. They don't think about things like flags and oaths and constitutions and laws. I keep saying this. Once you reach a certain point of power and wealth and influence, you're post-political. You're not actually worried. Oh, no, I'm going to answer that too, Victor. That's a good point, and I think that's something to talk about. Once you reach a certain point of power, wealth, and influence, you're not actually worried about elections. You want to get past elections. You want to get to a state where you don't have elections anymore. You're just unencumbered by democracy, because you look down at all the peons and you're just like, they don't know what they're doing. We know better. It's about profit. It's about power. So that's one of the reasons why like a Facebook works with Trump. It's not like they're ideologically right-wing or something. It just happens to be the way that they make money. They're post-political. They're not actually ideological. Victor says, I'm not sure about that. The market needs consumers too. The market would be making a bet that whatever happens in the country, things will keep going on the way that they've gone, which is the hope of people like Donald Trump and authoritarians. The idea is that they would completely pervert a democratic system into an authoritarian state, but it would still seem like a democracy, which is what a managed democracy is. That's what Putinist Russia is all about. It's about pretending as if you're a democratic state, while meanwhile nobody exercises their privileges and nobody exercises their rights because they're too afraid to. And if they act up, they're killed, and reality is altered completely. So I hear what you're saying. They need consumers, but the bet that they would be making is that the economy would be streamlined and focused for corporate power and corporate influence, and that people would just go on and pretend like something would keep going. Molly, and hi Molly, in the Speech and Network, that's exactly right. And if you haven't seen Network, you know what? I'm going to talk to Nick about this. That might be movie number 2 for the Muckrake podcast, analyzing movies, after we're done with the Republican National Convention. We might do Network. I think Network is one of the most prescient and telling movies of the modern age. You should go watch that. That's a great movie. John, for a moment, let's assume Biden wins, Trump is removed from office. How does the right respond? Do they continue their descent into paranoia and conspiracy theories? Yeah. There is a possibility that in the Congress that they will want to do some business with him. I mean, they know him. The people in Congress who are there from when Joe Biden was there, they like him just fine, and they've worked together in the past on things like, law enforcement and stuff like that. I think they would work with him, but that doesn't mean that the right wing of America would stop with their conspiracy theories, because that is their identity now. It's perceived loss of power and, perceived conspiracy theories. Gary, some people joke about how can anyone still be an undecided voter, but I think it's interesting to ask, given everything that's happening, what does it mean that some people are still unsure that they want another 4 years or not? I think a lot of Americans look at undecided voters or independent voters because, again, going back to what I was saying, they don't want to believe that they're persuaded. They don't want to think that they're part of a movement. They don't want to think that they're part of a pack, if you will. They're individuals. I think everybody knows at this point how they're going to vote. I think that they do. I think the independent voter is something that has been made up, particularly in the mind of the Democratic Party. They're constantly trying to appeal to an imaginary voter, the undecided, which, by the way, it has been defined by political scientists and political strategists. It is a white, undecided voter who isn't particularly liberal or interested in civil liberties or what happens to people of color, women, or LGBTQ Americans, which is one of the problems with the Democratic Party, for the record. Liz, we have 3 questions left. Any thought on recent polls? I don't have any thoughts on polls. Polls aren't really real. A lot of people get paid a lot of money to give you updates. It is also, it's more like feedback for how the networks and, these mainstream media, how they should cover the election. Polls don't matter. Polls just don't matter anymore, and they've never mattered. Who cares? I would much rather be in a country where we didn't have polls and then we went to the election and we voted and that was it. Personally, and this goes back to the question earlier, what would I do with a mainstream media company? I'm tired of politics being a show. I'm so tired of it being this industry the way that it is and the big theater all around it. Like, let's get rid of money in politics. Let's have presidential candidates host like an hour show in, I don't know, late September or October, maybe have like one debate. And I'm ready for boring newscast. Let's get to a point where politics isn't about spectacle and pizzazz, because I'll tell you what happens when you have spectacle and pizzazz. Reality TV stars win. Dysfunctional, insane people win elections. I would rather get away from that. Sam, can you talk about how corporate Democrats are bought and owned by oligarchs? What this means for democracy as we know it? How is there a class war happening with no one's help coming? The Democratic Party, going back again to the 1990s, they decided that the Republican Party was getting too much money from corporate donors and wealthy donors, and that they wanted in on part of that action. That happened. And they are less bought and sold than the Republican Party, but they depend a lot on very, very wealthy donors, and they are constantly going after corporations. They're going after big tech. They're going after all of these people who do damage to democracy in the world. I would love it if the Democratic Party would step away from that. It's one of the reasons I'm not a Democrat. And people are all the time, they're like, oh, you're in the can for the Democratic Party. I'm not. They are the only sane alternative to the Republican Party, which is infected with a terminal case of white identity, fascism, and authoritarianism. You have to vote Democrat because anybody who puts an R next to their name at this point is a problem. I would love if the Democratic Party would reject some of the stuff and go back into the 1970s, 1960s, where they actually fought for working people, unions, and people of color. I would love that. And they still do, don't get me wrong. They still go out and they push these things. But there is a part of it where they deal with a lot of high-ranking corporate fundraisers, and I think it's a big problem. Elizabeth, in light of Senate intelligence, the last one, by the way, Senate intelligence report, can you discuss the GOP's ideological alignment with Putin? Absolutely, I can. We don't even have to talk about conspiracy theories to understand what's happening here. What's happening in this, I about called it the Soviet Union. What's happening in Putin's Russia is exactly related with what's happening with America. What you have is this neo-fascistic movement, which is basically talking about, the good old days, the myth of what Russia used to be. And it's what's happening in America as well. That's what Make America Great Again is. Putin combined two things. He combined the Orthodox Church and he combined the Soviet Union. And he said, we should have both of these things. And these things are important. And this is going to be the power base for our nostalgia, our neo-fascistic appeal. And by the way, it's all based on, Christian white nationalism. In America, we have the exact same thing going on. The American right is engaged in the exact same project, which is continuing to venerate the past and past myths. And when you put all of those things together, Putinist Russia and Trumpist America, they are ideologically aligned. This is one of the reasons why you see polls where Republicans look up to Putin more than they do Obama. The other part is the conspiracy theory that animates both of them. They are quote unquote anti-globalist. Well, that is also anti-Jewish, but it's also the globalist project. Well, what they're interested in is not taking down globalism. They're actually interested in displacing the people who control globalism and taking it over themselves. And if they can do that themselves, they will have a new power base. And funny enough, I'm actually working on a new project. Hopefully I'll have good news about here soon. That looks at the project of Western civilization and these religious myths and how it connects fascism and neo-fascism. And I actually think that that is the wavelength that both of these movements are in, both Putinism and Trumpism. It's a group of people who are fundamentally, ethically, and ideologically toxic and poisonous, but they are appealing to people. They're appealing to people to try and remember past glories and to try and blame the failures on some sort of conspiracy that they can overtake. So they are ideologically aligned. And again, I've said this before, something to give you pause. There are moments where there are world wars that erupt and people choose sides. If America was to choose a side right now, you need to ask yourself, if it happened tonight, what side would we be on? We'd be on the side of Russia. We'd be on the side of Turkey and Brazil and, all of these neo-fascistic pieces of shit. And that is where the American right has led us to. What books are currently on my bedstand? Last question. Right now, I'm reading up on the decline of the Roman Empire. Why? Why would I ever do that? How could that possibly, resonate with what's going on today? But that is because of a larger project that, again, I'm hoping very soon to have good news about. But it's about fascism and oppression and throughout history. So real quick, couple of plugs, and then I'm going to get emotional because you all are the best. One thing, all this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, me and Nick Hausman of the Monk Rake Podcast, we are going to be streaming live from 9 p.m. until whenever Trump is done talking. God knows when that is. All you have to do is go over to patreon.com/Monk Rake Podcast, become a patron. You can join in on the live streams on our Patreon page. Like I said, anybody who, absolutely, we're going to have a pizza night one night. One of these nights, when we're dealing with fighting fascism, we're all going to order pizza on the same night and talk about that pizza while we get frustrated. So that is going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to come join us. And I promise you, anybody who's in the chat who was there last week, tell them that this is a good time because I thought it was a pretty damn good time. All you have to do, patreon.com/Monk Rake Podcast. If you want to support me, go over patreon.com/Monk Rake Podcast. American Rule comes out in 3 weeks. I'm terrified, but I'm excited. It is the hardest thing in my life that I have ever done, and it's probably the work that I've done that I am the most proud of. So I would love it if you pre-ordered that and got ready for it to come out on September 15th. And now with all that aside, and next week, Sunday, 8 p.m., Bourbon Talk, please come back. I hope you had a good time. Tell people, bring people along. I hope this was good for you. It's good for me. Real fast, just to be real, things are really frightening out there. And we really, really are on that precipice that I was talking about. It could get really, really bad. But the truth is, write fiction. I'm writing fiction. I'm working on a novel too, but we can't talk about that, Baker. I want you to know this. Look at all the people hanging out and talking about the state of the world and wanting things to be better. And this is only a fraction of the people who want that. We're at a precipice. Things could get really, really bad. And do not underestimate that. Do not for a second underestimate the fact that we are in real, real danger. But we could have something better. We could have something awesome and real and life-giving and human and decent. So don't stop fighting. Stop accepting scraps. Stop accepting forced austerity. It's unnecessary. The military-industrial complex is nothing but a white supremacist project and about redistribution of wealth. It doesn't have to feel like this. It doesn't have to work this way. We don't have to be in the middle of a pandemic where the government doesn't help. And we do not have to have a country where the government doesn't serve the people. But we absolutely, absolutely have to work and we have to fight. So on that note, cheers. All right, everyone. I'll see some of you tomorrow night covering the Republican National Convention. Other people, I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you so much. You give me hope. You inspire me. You make me feel like I'm not alone. I hope maybe I help with that as well. Take care, everyone. Be safe.